So, thank you. I'm excited to be here. So, I'm here to talk to you about the unexplained symptoms we inherit, the fears, the anxieties, the obsessive thoughts that we have biologically inherited from our parents and our grandparents. Symptoms we think are ours. But before I talk about this, I'd like to tell you about what led me here. My story, like many of our stories, didn't start with me. About 26 years ago, I began to lose the vision in one of my eyes. I was diagnosed with a chronic form of retinopathy, and there was no cure. And the way it was progressing, the doctors told me to expect that I would likely lose the vision in the other eye as well. And faces were now a gray blur and road signs I couldn't read. And everything I tried, hands-on healing, supplements, juice fasts, all seemed to make things worse. My worst fear was coming true. I'd go blind. I'd be unable to take care of myself. I'd fall apart. My life would be ruined. These sentences would serve to be the key to my healing. I just didn't know it at the time. They echoed traumas that had taken place in my family history long before I was born. So here I was. I'm losing more and more vision each day. I'm terrified. I'm desperate to make sense of what's happening to me. I leave my work. I leave my relationship. I leave my city. And I go on a search for healing, a search that takes me halfway around the world, as far as Indonesia, where I'm learning from some very wise spiritual masters, spiritual teachers. I'm sitting at the feet of gurus. I'm chanting, I'm fasting, I'm meditating for days on end. One time I sat on a cushion for 3 days and nights without, blindfolded, earplugged, 72 hours, no sleep, small bowl of rice in the morning, water, to come to know the madness of the mind. That was the goal. I discovered the madness of my mind was worst case scenario thinking. That if I could just worry hard enough, I could insulate myself from what I feared most. So it was during this time that I had a satsang, a meeting with a spiritual master, and I waited in line all day, and at 8 hours, and by the time I get to the front of the line, I'm thinking he's going to commend me for being this awesome meditator. Of course, I'm just moments away from total enlightenment. But instead, he looks right at me. Actually, I should say he looks right through me. And he could see what I couldn't see. And he said, "Go home and call your parents." Now, I was pretty livid, as you can imagine, because I had given my parents up for spiritual parents, divine parents, better parents, all these spiritually wonderful men and women who are guiding me to the next level of awakening. So I figured he was wrong, and I sought out even a greater spiritual master, one who imbued hundreds of people with his heavenly love all day long, and some waiting in line again all day. And I get to the front of the line, and the exact same words: "Go home and make peace with your parents." Well, this time I listened, but I just had no idea how I was going to do this. My relationship with them was entirely broken. In order to heal with them, I had to heal the inherited family trauma, though I didn't know it at the time, all the anxiety that I had inherited from my grandparents who were all orphaned in some way. Each of them lost their moms when they were infants. Well, 3 of them lost their moms as infants, and 1 lost her dad at 1, and ultimately her mom's attention because her mom's grieving. And this pattern of this terror, this anxiety of being broken from a mother's love, this is what passed down in my family. And the terror and the anxiety that lived in my body, this was the real cause of my vision loss. I remember being a small boy, maybe 5 or 6, running into my mother's room whenever she'd leave the house. I'm panicked, and I'm going through her drawers, and I'm pulling out her stockings, her nightgowns, her scarves, and I'm breathing in the scent because I'm never going to see her again, which is the truth for all my grandparents. And here this is 2 generations later. 40 years later, I tell my mom what I used to do, cry into her clothes. And she said, "Honey, you did that too? I did the exact same thing when my mother left the house." And my sister, just reading my book, calls me and says, "Honey, you did that too?" And I'm realizing that we all did the same thing. After healing this broken bond with my mother, my vision came back, and I felt compelled to teach these principles that I had learned, and ultimately developed a method for healing the effects of inherited family trauma. The latest epigenetic research tells us this is true. That when a trauma happens, a chemical change happens in our DNA, and this can change the way our genes function, sometimes for generations. Technically, there's a chemical signal, a chemical tag, an epigenetic tag that happens like this reaction in our DNA, and the DNA communicates to the cell and says, use this gene, ignore this gene. And then the way our genes are affected can change how we act or feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to the original trauma. For example, if our grandparents were born in a war-torn country, they could pass forward a skill set of sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times to deal with the trauma that they experienced. But the problem is we can inherit a stress response with the dial turned all the way up to 10, waiting for a trauma that never happens. And these gene changes and the continuous stress can be harmful to our body, like it was for my eye. These gene changes, these are the culprit, you see. And we're now learning that they can be transmitted to our children and to even our children's children. Scientists have long suspected that something like this was happening. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that this neuroscientist from Mount Sinai Medical in New York, Rachel Yehuda, discovered that Holocaust survivors and their children shared the same trauma symptoms. Specifically, the low levels of cortisol, that's the stress hormone that gets us back to normal after a stressful event. She also discovered a similar pattern in babies that were born to pregnant mothers who were at or near the World Trade Center when it was attacked during 9/11. And when these mothers went on to develop PTSD, their kids had 16 different genetic markers, low levels of cortisol, et cetera, symptoms like the mothers. Just last year, she discovered that traumatized survivors and their children share the exact same gene changes in the exact same region of the same gene. Technically, the FKBP5 gene, which is involved in post-traumatic stress disorder. She tells us that you and I are 3 times more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder if one of our parents had PTSD. And as a result, we're likely to struggle with depression or anxiety. So these patterns can be observed for 2 generations in humans. But studies with mice tell us that this pattern can be observed for 3 or more generations. Why mice? Mice have 99% of a similar genetic makeup as humans. So if we have something like 30,000 genes, mice have 29,700 genes approximately similar. And because a generation in mice is 12 to 20 weeks, where a generation in humans is 20 years, we can get rapid results. In one study done at the Emory Medical in Atlanta, they made male mice frightened of a scent, a cherry blossom scent. Every time the male mice were exposed to this cherry blossom scent, they electrically shocked the mice. And then when they dissected their brains, they found this epigenetic alteration, this modification. They found that their brains were enlarged where there would be a greater amount of smell receptors to detect this smell at lesser concentrations. And they found changes in the blood and changes in the sperm, so they took that sperm and they impregnated female mice who were not shocked, and in the next generation took the offspring, male mice again, and what they found in the next 2 generations is compelling. The pups and the grandpups, just experiencing the cherry blossom scent, freaked out. They were jittery, they were jumpy, as though they too were shocked, but they were never shocked. They inherited the trauma response, but did not experience the trauma directly. They also have separated mice from their mothers, and they can track the effects for 3 generations. I'll read you a short passage from my book. In one such study, researchers prevented females from nurturing their pups for up to 3 hours a day during the first 2 weeks of life. That was it. 3 hours a day, take the mice away from their mothers for just 2 weeks. Later in life, their offspring exhibited behaviors similar to what we call depression in humans. The symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged. Surprisingly, some of the males did not express the behaviors themselves, but appeared to epigenetically transmit these behaviors to their female offspring. Compelling, yeah. So how do we know if you and I have inherited family trauma? Well, of course, not all trauma is inherited. There are definitely some telltale signs when it is. We might experience a fear or a symptom that strikes unexpectedly or suddenly when we reach a certain age, 30, when our parents break up, our grandmother is widowed, and all of a sudden we start distancing from our partner, thinking our partner just doesn't do it for us anymore. Or we hit a certain milestone in our life, an event. We get married, everything's fine, now we're married and we're shut down. Or we go to have a child, or we get rejected for the first time by a partner, or we move to a new place. And it's as though there's this ancestral alarm clock inside us that starts ringing. I once worked with this woman. She was consumed with anxiety as soon as she became a new mother. She had no anxiety prior, but when she's pregnant, she's absolutely out of her mind. And so, using some of the questions I outline in my book, we determined that she had this horrific fear that she would harm her new baby. And I asked her the obvious, did you ever harm a baby? No. Did anyone in your family ever harm a baby? No. Wait a minute, she said. Oh my God, my grandmother, when she was a young woman, she lit a candle, caught the curtains on fire. The house caught on fire. Her baby was upstairs. She couldn't get her baby out. Her baby died, but we were never allowed to talk about it. She had inherited her grandmother's fear, the feeling that she could harm her baby, and it struck once she became pregnant. The trauma language that she inherited, now we're going to move into this idea of trauma language. The trauma language she inherited was, I could harm my baby, and it wasn't hers. Most of us carry trauma language like this. I call it core language. When a trauma happens, it leaves clues behind. Clues in the form of emotionally charged words and sentences. Clues that form a breadcrumb trail. That when we know how to follow this breadcrumb trail, it can lead us to traumatic events that have taken place in our family. Traumas that we may have biologically inherited the residue of our parents and our grandparents. And when we know how to find these unconscious words in us and link it to the event, it's like finding the missing piece of the puzzle that lets the whole picture come into view and gives us a context for explaining why we feel the way we feel. Remember my words, my trauma language. I won't be able to take care of myself. I'll fall apart. My life will be ruined. This was the language of orphans. Now, I'd like to ask you a question. And please take a few moments with the answer. Think about the answer. Write it down if you have a pad and paper. You're not going to be asked to share this. And it's one of the questions I ask in my book. But it can help you uncover inherited family trauma that may be affecting you in your life today. What? You ready? What is your worst fear? If things suddenly fell apart, if things went terribly wrong, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? This is probably a feeling that you may have felt like you've been born with. It's before you had children, because many people say, oh, something terrible will happen to my child. Of course, but go back earlier. Again, what's your worst fear? If things went south, if everything suddenly went terribly wrong, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? Take a minute. And now, whatever you came to, let's deepen this answer. Let's distill it. If that happened, whatever you wrote or whatever you're thinking, what's the worst part of that? If that happened, then what? For example, if you said, I could die, take it down further. And if that happened, then what? What's the worst part of that? One woman I worked with who said, I could die, she said, my children would be without me. And I said, so what's the worst part of that? And she said, I'd be forgotten. Can you hear how that has much more juice than I could die? And many of us said, I won't achieve my life purpose. Okay, take it down. Go another notch down. If that happened, what's the worst part of that? I'd fail. I'd be disconnected from people. I'd let people down. I'd have wasted my life. I'll be shamed, rejected. These emotionally charged sentences sound like this. I'll lose everything. I'll fall apart. I'll hurt someone. I'll let someone down. It'll all be my fault. I'll be abandoned. I'll be betrayed. I'll be humiliated. I'll go crazy. They'll lock me up. I'll lose my family. I'll lose control. I'll do something terrible. I won't deserve to live. These sentences can originate in our family history with someone else. And of course, they can originate in childhood, early childhood, and in utero. You can feel the quality of these sentences that have to do with a break in the bond with a mother. I'll be abandoned, rejected, betrayed, annihilated. I'll fall apart. If nothing came when you thought about this, ask yourself this question. What's the worst thing that could happen to someone else, not you? Probably something that happened to someone you knew from school. Probably something that happened, someone you knew in your neighborhood, someone you read about, someone when you were small. What happened to them that's so horrible? Write it down. It could be your sentence too. We're not that separate. And if you didn't get anything, what's a scene from a movie you can't watch? If you don't have your sentence, don't worry. You can work on it later. But this one sentence can unlock the mystery and help you heal inherited family trauma. Now, 2 more pieces. Say it inside. Once you get your sentence, just say it inside. Can you feel its reverberations in you? Where? Where do you feel it when you say that sentence? Where in your body can you feel it? Bring your hand there. Bring your breath there. Bring your awareness there. Now let's go deeper. Who in your family may have had cause to feel the same way? Who else shared this sentence? Your mother? Your grandmother who lost a child? Your father who failed and let down the family? Your grandfather who harmed someone? Start looking for the resonance of this sentence in your family history. Now I'd like to take you back to the beginning with me, where I learned to look for this inherited family trauma language, this trauma language. 20-some years ago, I worked with a lot of self-injurers, and I was working with this cutter. I'll call her Sarah. And Sarah, the way she cut that was unusual is she would cut into her arm or her abdomen or her legs so deeply that she would almost bleed to death. And her mom and her dad would have to take her to the hospital, and she'd be put into a psych ward for weeks at a time. She would almost bleed to death when she'd cut. So I asked her, Sarah, what do you think about right before you cut? Right as you're holding the razor blade, what are you thinking? And she said, I deserve to die? Now I'm looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life had just begun. And I say, Sarah, what have you done? Did you harm somebody? Did you accidentally cause an accident? Somebody got hurt? Did you leave somebody and they killed themselves? She said, no, nothing like that. So I did what I was trained to do. I looked at her relationship with her mother. Brilliant. Great relationship. I looked at her attachment with her mother. Secure. Strong. I looked at her relationship with her dad. Loving. She was able to receive love from both of her parents. I was flummoxed. And then I said, tell me about your grandparents. And then she dropped the bomb. She said, my grandmother was an alcoholic, and she was driving the car drunk with my grandfather in the passenger seat, and she hit into a pole, and my grandfather got cut, lacerated as he went through the windshield and died before the ambulance could get there. And in that moment, we made a crucial connection. In that moment, when she cut herself, it was from the grandfather, like the grandfather. When she felt she deserved to die, whose feeling was that? Yes, of course, the grandmother. Sarah's trauma language, I don't deserve to live, didn't belong to her. Most of us have trauma in our family history, yet not everyone manifests inherited family trauma. Why is that? Why do some people seem to relive and others don't? What makes these traumas repeat? Epigenetics is just one piece of the puzzle. What I found is what seems to anchor these traumas, what creates these repetitions, is when traumas aren't talked about, when the healing is incomplete, when people are excluded or rejected, and the pain and the grief and the shame and the embarrassment and the anger is too great, and there's no healing, there's no resolution. And when this happens, aspects of these traumas can show up in later generations. Unconsciously, we'll repeat the pattern or share a similar unhappiness, so that ultimately this trauma has another chance to heal. I believe that the contraction in a trauma is ultimately looking for its expansion and will repeat again and again until that expansion happens. And for that reason, I'd like to leave you with 3 insights. First, if we or one of our family members struggle with unexplained depression or anxiety or phobia or OCD or something we can't explain, we need to shake the family tree and see what falls out. What family secrets have been hidden? What stories didn't get told? What traumas never healed all the way? It's important to know these things, especially if we or one of our children are affected with things we can't explain, struggling with symptoms. I found that if we ignore the past, it can come back to haunt us. But if we explore it, we don't have to repeat it. We can break these destructive patterns. Number 2, talk about the traumas in your family history. Try to work through them so they're not passed down to future generations. The more we know about these traumas, and the more we talk about these traumas, the more we bring relief to our children who could be struggling with symptoms and not have a clue as to what's going on. We need to identify this trauma language and link it to the event so we can break the cycle and we can heal. And lastly, thirdly, we need to heal the brain's super efficient trauma response. that keeps us stuck in a state of suffering. Ultimately, we need to have new experiences that are powerful enough to override the old trauma response that lives in us. Then we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations of this new experience so that they can become ingrained in us and our brains can change. These can be experiences of receiving comfort or support from our ancestors, our parents, once we heal this. It can be an experience of compassion for them, for us. It can be an experience of receiving or feeling gratitude, generosity, loving kindness, especially for that part of us that's inherited this fragmentation or that got fragmented when we were young. Ultimately, anything that allows us to feel strength and peace inside. In the book, I lay out these practices, many of these practices, so we can heal. I'd like to leave you with one word, one sentence. Biological inheritance may be a reality, but it doesn't have to be our destiny. Thank you.